Well, welcome back. This is Module 2 of our PMBOK 5 Deep Dive. Here we're going to capitalize on what we've learned in Module 1 as far as our organizational strategies. We're going to look at the actual organizational culture that those strategies live in and how it relates to project governance. You can follow along, and you should read in detail Chapter 2 of your PMBOK as we go through this. Okay, here we have 2.1 in your PMBOK, by the way. We have a definition of organizational influences. Let's just read it. An organizational's culture, their style, the organization's style, and their structure, and key is the maturity of their project management and its systems. They all influence how well or how not so well projects are performed in the organization. So the culture, style, and the structure and your project management and its systems all contribute to how well your projects are performed. What are some of the conditions that affect project execution? There's a lot of them. But in particular, again, the maturity of your project management organization, of your PMO if you have one, of the systems you use, to do your project management activities and so on, are very key in how well your projects are executed. If you have multi-organizational projects, you have a project that affects many of your organizations if you're distributed, that would affect how well you can communicate, relate, and so on with your projects across the globe, for example, or even if it's across the street with another department because you're not co-located. Cultural norms is a huge problem that I mentioned before in your organization. It's very, very, very difficult to change cultural norms in your organization. So you have to adopt them, live within them, and execute your project with considerations for those norms so that you aren't being a renegade and specifically bucking the system. You don't want to do that. You want to help your project achieve its goals in the best way you can in the smoothest manner by aligning and partnering with those that can influence your project. Shared visions between your organization and your project, again, which is why it's important that you as a project manager understand why you're doing the project, what it contributes to your project, what value are you giving. That's a shared vision. It's a shared mission and values and the expectations that management would want of you to be able to do your project so that they know that you're on their side and you're contributing to what they're getting paid to do for the organization. Policies, procedures, methodologies, regulations that exist in your organization are all part of affecting the way you execute your projects. Risk tolerance, we'll talk about when we talk about risk management, the risk that your organization is willing to take to accomplish their missions and objectives has a significant bearing on how well your project is executed, particularly when you, as project manager, need to consider all risks on projects. You need to have a plan for those, what to do if they occur. And as we'll find out, remember this though, risk can be adverse. A bad thing happens, how are you going to recover? Or you may want a particular risk to actually occur and materialize because you can leverage an opportunity because of it, and we'll talk about that in risk management. Authority relationships, organizational structures, the way your organizational management, senior management is set up, your department managers, your project organization, all those things influence how well and efficient and effective a project execution could be. Your operating environment is how, what kind of organization are you? How do you operate? What are all your tools that are available to you to do your job is all important and will influence your project execution. Your organizations and your own projects, codes of conduct, work ethics, work hours, they all contribute towards the effectiveness of how you can execute your project. So all these are organizational influences, part of your culture. Communication, again, is huge for a project manager, but from an organizational point of view, project success is highly dependent on the communication capabilities of your organization. Some examples, could be, are you globalized? You need to talk around the world with things. Do you have virtual teams? That adds, as we'll see later on, and under human resources and a few other knowledge areas, virtual teams can be tremendously effective and cost-effective and beneficial, but then they could also be very difficult to manage because they're virtual. So we'll see about those. But communications with those virtual teams is a key component towards good project management and project success. The actual effective methods that your organization has in place now to communicate. And here are the main ones, and there could be others. Email, how are you going to use that? You need to control email. You have something like this, iPhone, you get emails all the time, and I know it's terrible to try and manage my emails. What do I archive? What do I delete? Same thing in the business, but these are official project records if you're using email, so you need to have a plan under project communications management, a knowledge area, how you're going to manage these things. That's just email. Texting is another one that's a terrible thing to manage. Are you going to allow it on your project? Instant messaging, same thing, texting. Social media, Twitter and those things. Facebook, social media is becoming a more and more accepted method of project communication. Not only to your team, but the outside world, if that's appropriate for you. But even within your team, these things are very viable methods, but you need to be able to control them in a manner that's consistent and perhaps secure. Web conferencing, another one, especially with virtual teams, or instead of having a 1 hour project meeting every Friday at 10 o'clock in the big conference room where people from all over your organization, your building, your campus come, you could just do it web conferencing, save a lot of time and trouble perhaps that way. So all this stuff is very key. And you need to decide up front when you're putting your project together, how are you going to communicate? And you need to put it in writing so that it's referenceable and it's repeatable. Now here we're going to talk in pretty good detail about the various different types of organizational structures that there are. And again, this is right from the PMBOK, so you need to know these. You need to know these and the differences between them. Now I'm going to list some, and these are from the weakest structure, where the project manager has the least control over the situation, to the strongest. The first one's called a functional organizational structure. This is the classic model. This is where most projects started, years ago, and where many of them are even now. Each staff, a department has a clear manager of a staff, the manager of finance, the manager of IT, etc., versus a matrixed, which is kind of the middle ground, and there are several types of matrixed organizations, as we'll see. But this is a blend of functional, that we just saw, and projectized, that's on the other end of the spectrum that we're going to see right after this. And the power and the influence of the project manager and the power and the influence of the functional manager determines if it's a weak matrix. You're a project coordinator. That's all you may be. You may be a project expediter. And really, because you're reporting not to a project management office, but you are trying to manage a project for, say, a functional manager in their department, trying to slice time of their employees whose job it is to do the functional manager's bidding in their department. You're trying to slice their time to do a project. And that's a very difficult thing to do, to get time consistently and to get the dedication and morale and all that support from these staff people who may not want anything to do with your project. And if it's mandated by your company to do a project, your functional manager may not want anything to do with it. So it's a very difficult situation to be in as a project manager. Therefore, it's weak. It's a weak position you're in. There's a balanced matrix, as we'll see later in some diagrams. The balance finally recognizes the need for a real project manager. And they have some authority, some decision-making capability, but they're still not fully provided full authority like you would really like. And then there's the strong matrix, kind of the other end of the matrix stuff, where there's a full-time project manager who is provided considerable authority to get the job done. And they generally have a full-time administrative staff supporting them, okay? And they report to what he called a manager of project managers, which could be a person dedicated to supporting a number of project managers from the PMO. That's a good place to be. In fact, and generally in an organization, this is your strongest one. It says strong, but there's one more, and that's projectized. This is an organization that is specifically designed to provide project management services. Team members, they're often always co-located. The project manager has incredible authority and decision-making capability. He's independent, and he can do what it takes to get this project done. And they may, in fact, be a separate organizational department called projectized, or project department. Not a PMO, but it's a special kind of organization called projectized. Now here's one that's not weak to strong. It's a hybrid. And here you have functional project manager structure, which is the weak one, but you have a full-time project manager supported by someone who knows really what they're doing and has influence to help you be successful in that functional kind of environment. You have a full-time dedicated staff in the functional department. This is where the functional manager has no choice. Your organization says, these people in your staff, because they're your knowledge experts in your department, they are assigned to this project exclusively. And then you may have some customized operating procedures outside of their functional job to do this. So here they are. You need to know these. Functional, you have your matrix from weak to strong, projectized, and then your hybrid. Now, why don't you think right now in your own environment, which one of these, are you? Interesting, isn't it? Now, here's the matrix right from the PMBOK. We're going to go through this quite a bit so you understand the difference. And if you're asked questions on the PMP exam, you'll be able to better respond to it. We're going to talk about the project manager's authority, what level of authority, resource availability, what latitude do you as project manager have in acquiring your team, okay? Who manages the project budget? This is incredibly important. Do you have control of the cost of your budget or not? Important. It can make or break you in the end. The role of the project manager and what kind of staff you may have. So let's look at functional. Your authority under functional, as you mentioned, you have little or no authority. You could be just a coordinator, just reporting back to somebody about things. You have little or no availability of getting your staff. Functional manager down here has control of the budget. Not a good thing from a project management point of view, but in their functional organization, you have to deal with it. So he has control of the budget. You need to convince him to give you money to get the project done right, to pay for people and whatever it is on your project. You have part-time authority or part-time role. You're just part-time like a coordinator, etc. Now, here is the functional organization. Again, this is right from the PMBOK. You see up there the dotted line, that's your project coordinator, your project expediter, whatever they may be. And by the way, the little blue bubble means that that's what I'm focusing on. Some of these slides may be a little busy, so if you see the blue bubble, that's what I'm talking about. So here you have your boss, whoever it is, chief executive. You have all your different departmental functional managers. And down there in the gray, you see, here's a staff here. Here's a person who is helping you with your project down here. And over here, there's a couple more, and you need to talk to these functional managers and convince them, negotiate with them to allow you to direct the staff in their project management functions. It's a difficult thing to do, slice their time. Many times it's difficult. And let's look at the far end of this before we get into matrix. The complete opposite end of this is projectized. Look, your project manager's authority is high to almost total. I mean, he has control of your project. He has control of the staff. He has control of the budget. Okay, he's a full-time with full-time dedicated people. That's where you'd really like to be on any project. Of course, that's not always possible. Generally, in the world, it's unfortunately functional is the way many projects are these days. And if you're lucky enough to have it matrixed, then you're a little better off. So here's projectized. Again, the dotted line here, you could still be a coordinator, but generally you're a project manager. You do your project coordination, that is. You are a full-time project manager and you have dedicated staff. Okay, there it is. And that could be repeated for many projects, as you see here. So this is what you really want. You're the project manager, you have dedicated staff, you do the work. Okay, now we're going to look in a minute at the, oh, by the way, look at this. Remember program management? You may have a program manager in between managing all of these projects or appropriate projects in a program management kind of environment. So that's where that would fit in. So here it is. Before we get into matrix, functional to projectized. You can see the big difference. Little to none to almost high. Little to none capabilities with attaining resources, human resources, to almost total. And finally, who manages the budget? Not the functional manager. You do, and that's the world you want to be in. So we're going to talk in a minute about matrixed and see the difference there. Okay, well here we're going to talk about the matrixed project management structure. We've talked about functional, how really weak it is. You don't really want to be in that place, although most project managers actually are, it seems. And projectized, the other end where you'd really like to be, that's pretty much total control over your project. But I think, matrixed is, where most projects now are migrating toward to some degree. So let's talk about that. We have the weak matrix. Again, just look down here. Project manager's authority, he has some now. It's low, but he has some. He has some say in getting resources. The functional manager still has control of the project budget. Still not a good thing, but at least you have a couple of wins up there. And you're part-time. You're not full-time, but you have a part-time job in a weak matrix on that. And you may have a part-time staff helping you if the project's big enough and you need that. Here's what it looks like in this graph. Down at the bottom, you see there's project coordination. Not coordinator, coordination goes on down there at the staff that you have some control over under the functional manager. Still, it looks just like the functional type, except you have a little more control that's been provided you. On the other end of the matrix is the strong matrix. Not quite as good as projectized, but if you can't get there, you really would like to be here. You have moderate to high control over your authority and decision-making on the project, moderate to high involvement in being able to acquire your project staff. This is the first time where you have complete control over the project budget, which is a good thing. And you're full-time, and any staff working for you is also full-time. And here's the matrix, this view. By the way, all these different views, and when we get into the process views, in the knowledge areas, you'll see that there are many different types of views that can convey the same information. And that can be very confusing to new people with going through the PMBOK. So we're going to make sure you understand all those so that you can open up the PMBOK and not be confused with what you see. But anyway, back to this. Here's your strong matrix. You have this manager of project managers again, which could be a senior project manager who you report to, and he could either be on his own in the organization or he could be part of a PMO. Whatever it is, you have an ally there, you have a mentor, as it were, and you work for him, and you have dedicated staff across the bottom and all those other good things in the strong matrix. So this is a very good place to be if your organization can provide that to you. So down here, again, we'll see the difference between the weak and the strong. Low authority, moderate to high, low resource capabilities plus moderate to high as far as getting your staff. Still, over on the left, the functional manager has control of the budget through functional and weak, but in strong and projectized, you have total control of the budget. Now down here is where your part-time, full-time change. In the balance, which we'll talk about next, you become full-time throughout balanced and strong and projectized, but you still have part-time in balanced, but full-time and strong. So keep that in mind. Now here's balanced. Balance means, okay, instead of low and moderate to high, you have low to moderate as far as your authority, low to moderate with resource availability, not too bad. Mixed, both you and the functional manager manage the budget. You collaborate together to get what you need, negotiate, and you get what you need, hopefully. You, although are full-time with the balanced, as we saw earlier, you become full-time. That's the definition of balance, but still have part-time staff. And here's the balanced organization hierarchy. There you are down there, project manager. You have staff. You coordinate them. There is no manager of PMs here, so you officially don't have a mentor, although you, of course, could have one outside of this. But that's the balanced organization. So low to moderate, role, resources, mixed, you share the budget. You go from part-time to full-time, and you still have part-time staff. So you need to know these, understand these. So if PMP asks a question, where do you go from part-time to full-time in your role, you need to know that it's a balanced matrix, for example. And here's composite. This is your hybrid organization. As a coordination, we have staff under the functional manager there. Not a good thing. But over on the right, you may have a actual project manager assigned to some staff at the bottom. So the bottom row is dedicated to the project manager. Over on the left, you have that dedicated person plus a person on the functional manager staff that you do not have control over directly. And the reason for that be that staff with the red circle around it may have special technical or operational expertise in that functional organization that is needed by you to accomplish your project objectives. So this is a mixed, composite, hybrid of full-time, dedicated project people to a shared functional person. So now we're going to move on to the definition of these two. These are two very critical definitions that we're going to talk about. You'll see these all throughout every module we talk about from here on in. They're important. Again, when we talked about organizational process assets a little earlier in our prior module, let's look at it again. These are assets, okay, processes, and procedures. They're your organizational assets that your organization has at hand to give you to use on your project. And they are defined as any artifact, any practice, or any knowledge is an asset, right? Intellectual knowledge that can be used to the success of a project. This is a definition of this from the PMBOK. During the initiating and the planning process groups, remember there's 5 of those, and the first 2 are initiating and planning, the things that could come to bear from your organizational process assets could be guidelines that are written to do a job that pertains to you and your project, process tailoring criteria. Again, we have 47 processes in PMBOK, and some of those may need to be tweaked and tailored a little bit for your project, for your environment, called tailoring. And your organization may have some criteria on how you are to tailor these things so that you don't totally dilute the function. They may have some guidelines to do that. And that could be considered maybe knowledge. That's just my thought, but that could be a knowledge, because we're saying processes and procedures are artifacts, practices, and knowledge. That could be a knowledge. You could also have your operating standards, organizational standards, all your policies, procedures, standards, life cycles. They may have, here's the different kind of life cycles our organization uses depending on the type of project. That could be your practice. That's how you practice things. And of course, things like templates or artifacts. And there are more things, artifacts coming up in the second part of organizational process assets here. But generally, these are the kinds of things that are available or could be available in your organization. If you don't have any of this stuff available, then you're on your own, and you need to create your own organizational process assets so that on your next project you can go back to see what you had and reuse things so you don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. The whole point here is consistency. Be consistent in your project, because when you're consistent, your efficiency goes up, your knowledge, you don't have to relearn everything, and just the general success of your project is more likely. So under initiating and planning, these are the kinds of things you might be able to get from your organization to help you. During the executing and monitoring, and actually it's executing and the monitoring and controlling, those are two more process groups. Executing is one and monitoring and controlling. That's where you build stuff. You may get change control procedures that are in the organization. How do you do change control? And you need to do that because change is a huge capability of your project management function. Financial control procedures. How are you going to manage your costs? Maybe they have requirements, procedures. Issues and defect management. Big deal here. You need to follow these procedures so that you're consistent. Communication requirements. Again, we talked about that. Whatever is required by your organization, you need to pick up on and fold that into your project plan. How do you assign people to work? That's your work authorization procedures. If you have them, you need to use them. Risk control procedures, same thing. If you have them, you need to leverage those. And performance measurement criteria. And this is a big deal we're going to talk about later on, is how do you measure your project performance? You know you're on track. How do you do that? So these are all executing and monitoring process assets that you may be able to use. And in a minute here, we're going to talk about closing, and then we're going to go on to some other things. Okay, well, here we're going to complete our discussion of organizational process assets. Again, we were going through the various process groups and looking at the typical kind of assets that could come to bear in those groups. And here's the last one, the closing process group. When you're doing project closure, there may be certain closing guidelines and requirements in your organization. But if there aren't, you certainly want to do these things on your own. You want to file your lessons learned. Throughout your project, you'll have problems, you'll have good things happen. You want to document those so that future project managers or yourself later on can reread these things, and you can either avoid problems, you know how to get around them, or you'll capitalize on things that work well. That's your lessons learned. Any kind of audits, quality audits from your deliverables on your project, you want to file those away under closing process. Project evaluations that you may have from stakeholders, et cetera, certainly you'll file those during closing. Deliverables validations, as we'll see, validation is a process where you funnel your deliverable through scope management to make sure that actually what was built is what the client wanted. Okay, you'll file those validations away, and any kind of acceptance criteria for your deliverables, you want to document those, of course, and file those during closing. And by the way, during closing, as we'll see, you can either close the entire project, I'm done, or if you're a phased project, which we'll see a little later on in this module, if it's phased, you may go back to the beginning, initiate your next phase, and then do all this stuff over again for the next phase. So it's this kind of iterative kind of project management. And closing could be either a phase or the entire project itself. So again, organizational process assets are things that are available to you from the organization that you can use and look up and reuse for the benefit of your project. And by the way, of the 47 process group processes, the 47 processes amongst those 5 process groups, here's an interesting statistic. Organizational process assets are inputs to 38 or 80% of those processes. So 80% of the processes use organizational process assets as inputs to them. So it's very significant, very pervasive. There's also such a thing as being able to update those assets because of your project. And 14 of those processes actually update, file away lessons learned, file away revised templates or whatever, but 14 of those processes are geared toward, amongst other things, to update organizational process assets so they keep them fresh, alive for you and for the next project manager. So that's 30% of the processes update organizational process assets. Now the other part, category of organizational process assets is a corporate knowledge base. Again, intellectual property is an asset. What's in there? You can have configuration, management, knowledge bases. This is where you keep all of your versions of your documents. They're controlled. Could be standards, policies, procedures, your project documents. Which project documents, as we'll see soon, is a very specific category of project management. Okay, so your project documents can be in a configuration management database, version controlled. All of your historical information of your project and the lessons learned go into some knowledge base, so it's available to others. You may have an issue and defect management database with the status of your issues and defects and the resolutions applied. That's all knowledge-based stuff, part of your organizational process assets. Process measurement databases, which is a quality control of function. They're available there. You know, you can see what you did, how your quality was measured, and the results and so on. It's always available, should be. And all project files, prior project files, should be available in the corporate knowledge database. So that plus all your processes and procedures, as we've talked about, comprise organizational process assets. And notice one thing we didn't mention here is software. You'd think, well, I buy a software product, it costs me, you know, $50 or it costs me $1,500. It's an asset. Well, maybe from a financial point of view, but from a project point of view, it is not an organizational process asset. What it is we'll see, it's one of the environmental factors. You say, why? Well, because there's a distinction here. And this is where a lot of PMBOK readers have difficulty with this. But the difference between a process asset, which is right there, it's in your database, it's a written procedure, it's like that. Environmental factors could be, they're learned. You learn these things. They're not given to you cut and dried. You learn them. So as we'll see with software, for example, you learn to use the software. It's an environmental factor, and how you use that software affects your project. Keep that in mind. If you get a question on a PMP exam, say, you know, is software an OPA or an EEF? You'll know that it's an environmental factor. So these environmental factors are the environment. They're out there. You don't have any control over any of this stuff coming up here. The organizational culture, you learn it, right? You don't go to your assets and say, give me the culture. No, you learn this stuff. It's just out there. You have no control over it. The structure, the governance of your organization, environmental factor, you need to deal with this stuff within your project execution. Human resources, people. You say, well, they're an asset. Well, no, they're really an environmental factor. They're not under your control, those people. You know, you can get them, you know, but they are an environmental factor, human resources. Stakeholders' risk tolerances. That's their mental thing about how much risk am I willing to take. You know, that's a culture thing. You know, they learn how to do this. You need to learn what they learn and apply it to your project. Environmental factor. The political climate of your company, of a third world company where you have people out there running a project. The political climate. You need to learn that, you know, and adjust to it. So it's an environmental factor. The infrastructure of your organization, you know, your computing infrastructure, communications infrastructure, you know, just everything in your company is an environmental factor. You don't have any control over that. You need to learn what it is and adapt your project to it. Here's software. The main piece of software could be your project management information system, whatever you use to help you do scheduling, you know, and put all of your information in there that eventually ends up in your corporate database, knowledge database. That's an environmental factor, and all software. So keep that in mind, all software. You can question it all you like, but the bottom is, remember, PMP exam, answer it the PMBOK way, and software is an environmental factor. Here's statistics on your EEFs too now. Of the 47 group processes, 27% of them, are almost a little more than half, use environmental factors as inputs to them to help you transform that plus other inputs to that process into outputs. You need to consider these factors as you transform into your outputs. Now, check this out. You can, in fact, update environmental factors in your organization, but only under two circumstances, and they both have to do with human resources. You know, you can provide more skills for your staff. You can train them. You can do things like that. So there are two different ways you can update the environmental factors, the learned things that your team has by training them properly and so increasing their skills. And we'll see those when we talk about human resource management. So that's enterprise environmental factors. So these two things, the OPAs and the EEFs, are very critical. They're very pervasive. You hear a lot about them. You may get tired of hearing about them, but in each of the processes that they apply, there are different little innuendos about what it is that they bring in to you to transform into your outputs. So in a minute, now we're going to start talking about actual project stakeholders and how they apply and relate to your team. Okay, welcome back. Here we're going to talk about project stakeholders and project governance. You need to know that all your team members, of course, are project stakeholders, and you yourself are a project stakeholder, a big one, almost on a par with the project sponsor. You can see from the diagram here that we have the project core team. right in here. That's the project manager, any kind of project management team you may have directly working with you, and other team members. They're all part of the project team. Now, internal, that's internal. External is outside your company. And anyone that is just interested in your project to whatever degree are stakeholders, and they can be very significant influencers, whether you know it or not, on your project. So here, the blue arrow here on the right shows that even sellers, your suppliers, business partners outside of your organization, if they have anything to do with your project, and even if they don't, they could be an influencer to your project. Let's say you have you're buying some equipment from company A on your project, and company B is miffed because they didn't get the project. They could be causing trouble internally, talking to people in your company about how poor the selection they made. That's a bad influence. So you need to know these people and keep track of them. They are a risk. So they would go in your risk register. You need to be aware of those and minimize the impact these people may have on your project. So stakeholders are anybody, passive, active, that have anything to do with or could influence your project in a negative way. Or if they could influence it in a positive way, you want to nurture them even if they are not the direct receivers of your project benefits. So stakeholders can be many, 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 more than you might think. And you need to manage all of their expectations. When we talk about, in a few modules, project stakeholder management, we'll get into this in a lot of detail, and you'll just see just how important they are and why we talk about this first before we ever get into project schedule and stuff like that. That's way down the line. Project governance. Okay, this is different from your organizational governance, how your senior management runs your company. That's organizational governance. Project governance is different. They may provide a project framework for you. They may define project success. What is success? How do you define it in your organization based on their culture? How do you do that? There may be organizational charts for projects. Remember the weak, strong, balanced, all that stuff. It may be an asset that you can use that's defined under some project governance structure. Communication guidelines could be there too. Decision-making processes. There may be some restraints, some guidelines, or whatever to help you as project manager make the right decisions confidently that will be recognized by others, and they will act. You don't want to make a decision and have your staff or whoever say, I don't care what you say. Who are you? I'm going to do it this way. Well, no, if your organization has a project management governance, then it should be enforced, and they should listen to you. It's a very powerful thing if you have this. There are different kinds of life cycles that we'll see very shortly here, and your organization may define under project governance what those are and which ones may be most appropriate for your particular project. If you're doing like waterfall projects, you may have a phase gate review criteria, procedures that's part of your governance, project governance, and how you do those things. Processes to augment your authority. There may be ways that the governance framework will support you in giving you the authority you need, or perhaps even increasing it depending on circumstances. And finally, how do you align with your internal stakeholders? There may be some guidelines there from a project governance point of view. So if you do have governance framework project in your organization, that's a good thing to have. You need to take advantage of these things because they've been done for a reason, and you don't have to redo them, and they may provide you a lot of efficiency in that. So project governance. We talked about project success earlier. Let's look at it again. Now this is from PMBOK, of course. Everything here is from PMBOK, so think the PMBOK way. Project is completed, quote, completed, within certain constraints of quality, resources, risk, your approved baselines for your triple constraint, which is scope, time, and cost, and degree of customer satisfaction, which we saw in Table 1-1 under Organizational Project Management. So if you do all of these things, you complete it within your quality constraints, your deliverables have met your quality metrics that you will define under quality management. If the constraints of your resources, getting your people, and resources here could be your materials that you need to build your stuff, whatever, all those constraints, if you manage them properly and your risk is under control and your project is run according to your baselines, and your customer is happy in the end, that is project success. So this is a definition you need to know in case you're quizzed on this in any manner. Project success. Your project team itself could be dedicated, could be part-time, as we saw in the various organizational structures for project management. You could have a project manager, you could have your staff, and you could have others who carry out the work, do things. Your programmers, for example, may not be on your project team, You may go to their functional manager and say, you know, here's our project. They need to code this thing, and they do their work under the project functional manager. Not part of your team, but they're, you know, I'm sorry, they are part of your team, but they're not involved with the management of your team, your core team. And again, you are the team leader if you're the project manager, regardless of your authority. You are the only one that is running the project, and regardless of your level of authority, you are the team leader. Here's project life cycle characteristics. Now, look at this graph. This is from the PMBOK, of course. All these, I'll tell you otherwise, but otherwise all these graphics are right from the PMBOK. We start. Now, this is different than your process groups. These are not the same as, I mean, this is not the definition, just a different definition of your initiating, planning, executing, controlling, and monitoring, and closing. They relate, they correlate, but they're two different definitions altogether. So for a project life cycle, you will have a start, which is right here, starting the project. Then you organize it and you prepare the project right here. And notice down here, here's where your project charter is, which is part of your initiating process group. Okay, and this is your effort. This dotted line is your level of effort in the aggregate for the project. Starts to build up. Once you do your project management plan, which you have most of the things together where you can actually start intelligently and with control creating your deliverables, then you carry out the work. That's the project life cycle part. And then you close the project here, and of course things taper off. Your deliverables are delivered and you archive everything. Now if we look at this particular graph here, project risk, uncertainty, and cost. And I show this again because it's in the PMBOK, and they may show you this and ask you questions about it. But you can see here, basically, your risk and your uncertainty is highest at the beginning of the project, tapers off through progressive elaboration, so that your risk and uncertainty is very low at the end, hopefully. And again, you want to make any changes and corrections in the direction of your project way early in the game, because like with anything, classic example is software programming. You can make changes easily in the beginning, but later on, toward the end, if you make a change to that software or to a project or whatever, your costs are going to just like skyrocket. And the rework will be incredible. The propensity for errors to come in will be crazy. So, you know, you always want to do this first. So all this is saying is that your risk is high. Identify your risk at the beginning. Moderate your risk. Have a plan in place so that at the end, you know, this doesn't occur, cost of changes. And if you do that, this will be low at the end. So know this. So here we're going to take some time in just a minute, and we're going to talk about the different kinds of project phases that you might be confronted with or be appropriate for your project. So we'll be back in a second. Okay, here we're going to talk about, under the umbrella of project life cycles, we're going to talk about project phases. These you'll need to know, the concept about them anyway. You can have a single phase project. One phase looks like this. Your initiating processes come in, and now actually we're talking about process groups here. This is your initiating process where you start the project officially, you do your project charter. You do all your planning here. Then when your plans are to the right level of clarity, you can actually execute, start building your deliverables according to the plan. You go back, you progressively elaborate, and you do better and better. You make sure that what you're building is correct and proper. You go round and round and round here, progressive elaboration, and this is all under the umbrella of what? Monitoring and controlling. Remember, that process group is pervasive from beginning to end. That's where they monitor what you're doing and control it by giving you preventive actions or corrective actions to keep you on track so that you execute according to the plan. And eventually you pump out the other end with your closing processes. And that would be a single phase project. You start here, you do your thing, you're done. Okay, now you could have multi-phase sequential projects like this. Same kind of thing, except, you know, the closing of one then starts the next phase over here of this. You do your thing here, you deliver it over here, and then you start the next phase here. A waterfall project might be considered like this, where these could be your phase gates. You go from developing, you know, your code over here, you deliver it, and then you go into your testing over here. You test it, you go into your pre-production, you know, stuff over here, whatever, multi-phase to do it. But you could have multi-phase just like this. Then you can overlap them, same kind of thing, except here's where you may need to initiate a project before the prior phase is completely finished. You know, maybe during executing over here in this first phase, say design phase, see, you may start construction before all of your design is done. So still, you know, at some point in your executing here of design, you may start your initiating of the construction phase overlapping. So that's your multi-phase overlapping. So you need to know those. Life cycle modes. A little different here. Now there are several types of these. You got to know these. You have a predictive, they call it predictive, where it's fully plan driven, just like a waterfall project. Here you go, phase driven, phase gates, waterfall, plan driven. Predictive, you know what's going to happen. You have iterative, incremental. Phases intentionally repeat themselves to do things. The product, as the product understanding increases, you go back and you repeat progressive elaboration again. Could be this kind of thing with a life cycle approach that way. Or adaptive is where you have this rapid fixed time schedule iterations, you know, like you do your sprints, you pick out of a stack of 50 activities you want to do to support the project, you pick the top 5 and you do those in 2 weeks. That's an agile approach, and that's called adaptive also. So you could have agile going here, you could have waterfall going. Under predictive, you could have a combination of those things depending on what you have going under iterative and incremental. So it all depends on the nature of your project, you know, how you want to manage them, how you want to cut and slice your requirements to get them done. But these are the 3 types that you need to know for the PMP exam. So what we've done here now so far is gone through, for the first module and this one, looking at it from the organization on down to you, the project manager, and how you contribute to the success of the project, to the success of the providing business value to your organizational constituents, and then the various types of organizational process assets that are available to you or could be available if your organization is that mature where you have these available, or maybe they're on your own PC or your neighbor project manager's PC. Let me see what you did last time. Let me see your lessons learned. Well, I didn't do any lessons learned. Well, that's a bad thing. You know, now you have to like start all over and make the same mistakes again, or if you had those assets, you'd be in a much better world. And your environmental factors, the things you have no control over, but you have to deal with in way more than 50%, you know, of the processes. So big deals. You need to, you know, get your mind wrapped around this organizational structure, influences, culture to do your projects better. Now, what we're going to do next time in Module 3 is we're going to talk now specifically, now that we know all this, and why we're doing projects and how we contribute to the organization. We're going to get right into the project management trenches, and we're going to talk in detail about the various knowledge areas and the process groups. As you see here, we're going to look at the interactions between them and how they how they're dynamically managed and contribute toward your project. So we'll do that in Module 3. So we'll